A Stuart beam engine refurbishment, part 4. Finishing the painting, cleaning the parts and starting the reassembly. The coat of paint that was originally applied to this engine, the light sort of mammoth green, was quite porous, so the first coat of this green seemed to soak into the previous coat of paint and left some dry spots or dull spots on the paint. So in this episode I'm giving the engine a second coat, but don't worry, I'm not going to go mad and show it all. I'll just show edited highlights of the second coat. In one of the other episodes, and I think I've replied to some viewers on this question, I said that this paint was GNR green or Great Northern Railway green, but it isn't. It's blue. I really must go to the opticians. This colour blindness is getting to be a problem. This is British Railways locomotive green. It's almost the same. It's very similar to British Racing green and Brunswick green, but just for the record, to make sure everything is all present and correct, this is called BR Loco green. And to be exact, I think it is the pre-1953 shade of green. What I'm doing at the moment is painting some of the parts that I totally forgot about. You've just seen me painting the top of the cylinder, which looks really good against the cast iron outer part. And now it's time to paint the pulley. I'm only painting the inside parts of this pulley, but I am getting some paint on the outside parts, but it wipes off very easily with a cloth. I've moved the camera into the outer part of the workshop, and this is right by a large open door, because I'm going to be doing some spray painting, and this is etch primer, which has an acid built in, and I don't really want to breathe this in. I can't see it being very good for you. What I often do when I'm spray painting parts like this is hold my breath. It doesn't take very long. It's not a case of holding my breath for 10 minutes, but during this process I'm not breathing. Maybe that's why I keep feeling weird and falling over. What I normally do is hold my breath for a while, stop the painting, go outside, take a few deep breaths, and here I'm outside because I'm not painting. In fact, I'm outside having a good breathe because I've finished this part of the painting, so now I'll leave it overnight to dry. And early the next morning, it looks like this. I'm quite pleased with the finish. There was one small mark that I rubbed down that I haven't bothered showing, and now holding my breath once again, it's time for the red primer coat. The etch primer that I applied, the grey stuff, is really strange. It goes on horribly and you think, oh, what a mess, but then suddenly, like all Precision Paints products, it flattens out and you come back the next day and it looks really nice. I'm rotating the piece of wood upon which the base rests so I can get at all the edges. A few viewers have been asking me about paint and where they can get it from. Apparently, Blackgates Engineering cannot ship paint overseas. I think that in order to ship paint overseas, you need a special license, which is quite expensive. I'm not sure about that, but Jackie at Blackgates Engineering explained that they cannot ship paint to other countries. At the moment, nothing is happening on screen. That's because I'm out in the garden, in the rain, breathing. The next day I had a look at the primer, and the reason it's a different colour is because it was a very bright sunny morning and the daylight was streaming in through the garage door. And it's time now to give it the top coat, or the first of the top coats. This is satin black. Gloss black would be too glossy, matte black would be too matte and show every oil stain, but satin black is about right. And in exactly the same way as I did with the primer coats, I rotate the component so I can get really good coverage on the edges as well as the top surface. I'm told that the best way to use spray paint is to apply thin coats, and that's what I normally do, but then at the end I apply a heavier coat. And I get a good finish, so I must be doing something right. It's easier though when you're spray painting a flat plate, because there's very little chance of the paint running. Gravity is on your side. But if the plate was vertical, you would get drips and runs, which is not nice at all. And now the job has finished, my breathing will return to normal, and I'm just going to leave it to dry. It's time now to clean up the individual components. Don't forget this engine was originally quite rusty because it had been stored in a cellar. So during the painting process, because the parts needed cleaning up, it really didn't matter if I got some paint on the shiny cast iron bits. And now, using a piece of well-worn Scotch-Brite, I'm cleaning off all the rust and the paint at the same time. I'm working on the pulley that you've just seen me paint, but in reality that was yesterday. I would normally do all the painting at the end of a workshop session, then I can leave the parts on the bench for the paint to dry. It's time now to fully dismantle the top end of the engine, and in this clip I'm removing the Watts parallel motion. I need to remove the two bars that support the Watts parallel motion so that I can clean up the metal parts and finish the painting. I did paint the recessed parts of these beams, but I didn't make a very good job of it and missed some, and it's going to be easier to paint the part when it's on the bench. In this clip I'm using the edge of a steel ruler to remove any paint that is where it shouldn't be. And then I'm giving the cast iron part a good going over with some Scotch-Brite, because this part is also rusty. The previous owner of this engine stored it in a cellar, which is not a good idea really, because it went rusty just about in every possible place it could be rusty. Not seriously badly rusty like you see on some engines, but rusty enough to make it look horrible. With the help of some machine oil and a piece of wet or dry sandpaper, it's the big cleanup operation, and this takes ages. This is a fraction of the footage that I did have of this. I've only shown a very small part of it, but I'm sure you get the general idea. And in the end, it looks like this. And now that the top of the column's also been cleaned up thoroughly, it's time to reassemble. The usual mention, of course, don't over-tighten the bolts. These are only 2BA bolts, and if you're too heavy-handed, you may shear them off. Then you have a problem. One down and one to go. I'm now working on the other side. You may have noticed that these two parts are different. The recesses are milled square on this side, which must have taken quite a lot of doing with a milling cutter that size. In this clip, I'm just taking the opportunity of having the part flat on the bench to apply some more paint in the recess and make it look better. That is, if this small paintbrush stops falling apart. This engine used to be mine before I sold it to my friend who kept it in a cellar, and when I first got this engine, one side was completely plain. So I machined the plain side to be similar to the other side, but not with square edges. I don't have a milling cutter that small, and if I did, I would probably break it anyway. For the moment, you'll have to imagine the other side being cleaned up and fitted. I've put the bolts in place so I don't lose them, and while the paint is drying, I'm going to fit the bearing blocks. These are the main crankshaft bearing blocks, and the first one's going in place, and it doesn't really matter which is which, because they're both supposed to be the same. Before I fitted the bearing blocks though, I did notice that underneath, where the holes had been drilled for the mounting bolts, they hadn't been deburred, so they didn't sit perfectly flat. And that's no good at all, so I just deburred the holes using a twist drill. And now both of the bearing blocks sit perfectly flat on the bed plate and on top of the pedestal. And when I put the crankshaft in position, everything seems to be fine. The crankshaft rotates okay, and everything seems to sit pretty level. Now that the paint on top of the cylinder is also dry, I can refit the gland, and I fit the two bolts that hold the gland into the cylinder, and the cylinder can be now fitted to the bed plate. This is a surprisingly fiddly job. There's not much room to manoeuvre, but as you can see, everything's going in place eventually. It's very important not to initially tighten the bolts. Leave the cylinder slack on the bed plate. The time to tighten the bolts is when the beam is in place, and the parallel motion is in place, and the piston rod is connected to the parallel motion. By doing it this way, you can get everything to perfectly align, and a beam engine such as this will not run properly unless everything is aligned perfectly. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.